This is the story of a sweet little orphan girl named Heidi. For the past 5 years, she has lived in the city with her aunt. But now, Deet has found a new job in Frankfurt and can no longer take care of Heidi. With no other choice, she decides to leave Heidi with her grandfather, Albert, who lives alone high up in the Swiss Alps. The neighbors warn Deet that Albert is a hot-tempered man who keeps to himself and wants nothing to do with other people. But she has no alternative. One day, Deet holds little Heidi's hand as they climb the steep mountain trail. The moment the cool mountain breeze touches her face, Heidi's eyes light up with joy. Feeling truly free for the first time, she takes off her heavy boots and thick coat, then happily runs barefoot through the soft green grass. Deet tells her to be careful, but Heidi can't stop smiling as she enjoys every moment of the beautiful mountain path. After playing and laughing all the way up, they finally reach the small wooden cabin where Grandpa Albert lives. As soon as Deet sees him, she calls out to him. The moment Albert notices Deet approaching, he stands up with an irritated look on his face. In a harsh voice, he shouts that he doesn't want the responsibility of raising a child and orders them to leave immediately. Frightened, Heidi quietly looks at her grandfather. Deet pleads with him, begging him to let Heidi stay for just a little while because she can no longer care for her. But Albert refuses to listen. Finally, Deet lets out a deep sigh and says, "Fine, if you won't take her, I'll bring her back to the city." She takes Heidi's hand and starts walking away. But after only a few steps, she secretly hides Heidi behind the cabin and whispers, "Stay here." Then she quickly hurries down the mountain by herself. It doesn't take long for Albert to realize that Deet has tricked him and abandoned Heidi behind. Furious, he rushes outside and shouts after Deet as she disappears down the mountainside.
But she never looks back. Frustrated, Albert storms back into his cabin and slams the door shut. Left alone in the freezing cold, little Heidi begins to cry. When no one answers the door, she quietly walks into the nearby goat barn, where her grandfather keeps 2 goats. Curling up on a pile of dry hay, Heidi is forced to spend her very first night there, alone. The next morning, when Albert stepped outside his cabin, he found Heidi asleep on a pile of hay in the goat barn. Without saying a word, he milked one of the goats and handed her a bowl of fresh, warm milk. Throughout the day, he kept himself busy with his work and mostly ignored. That evening, as darkness settled over the mountains, Heidi timidly asked, "Grandpa, where should I sleep?" In a gruff voice, Albert replied, "Wherever you want." Inside the cabin, Heidi noticed a small ladder leading up to the attic. When she climbed up, she found a cozy bed of fresh hay and a tiny window overlooking a sky filled with countless stars. Smiling with delight, she made the hay her bed and peacefully fell asleep, enjoying her first night in the attic. The following morning, Albert was outside chopping firewood when a 13 or 14-year-old boy arrived, herding a large flock of goats. His name was Peter, a village boy who took everyone's goats up into the mountains to graze each day. Albert stopped him and asked him to take his 2 goats along with the rest of the herd. He also told Peter that Heidi would be joining him so she could learn about life in the mountain. Hearing that, Heidi jumped with excitement. Albert packed her a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and sausage, and she happily set off with Peter and the goats. High in the mountains, Heidi spent the entire day chasing after the goat, playing among the wildflowers, and soaking in the freedom all around her. She felt like a little bird that had finally escaped its cage and could fly beneath the wide-open sky. Seeing how happy she was, Peter couldn't help but smile. By the time they returned home that evening with the goat, Heidi's face was glowing with joy. For the first time in her life, she had experienced what true freedom felt like. Back at the cabin, Heidi was a little shy around her grandfather at first. But before long, a quiet and heartfelt bond began to grow between them. The next morning, Albert got to work early. He spent hours sawing and hammering pieces of wood until he had built a small wooden chair. That evening, when Heidi came home after playing outside, she noticed something different. There were now 2 chairs at the dinner table. Albert gently patted her on the head and said, "From now on, this is your home. You'll live here with me." The moment Heidi heard those words, she couldn't contain her happiness. Tears filled her eyes as she ran into her grandfather's arms and hugged him tightly. After many lonely years, joy had finally returned to Albert's life. As time flew by, Heidi settled into her new life in the mountain. Every day, she followed Peter into the hills to graze the goat, ran freely through the meadows, and breathed in the fresh mountain air. With each passing day, her bond with Grandpa Albert grew stronger. Before long, winter arrived. Snow covered the mountain, and the cold settled over the valley. During the winter month, Peter left to stay with his grandmother so he could attend school. With Peter gone, Heidi sometimes felt lonely on the mountain. Wanting to cheer her up, Albert carved a beautiful little wooden bird and gave it to her as a gift. Then he built a sturdy wooden sled. Grandpa and granddaughter spent hours racing down the snowy hills together, their laughter echoing across the mountains. But those happy days couldn't last forever. A few years passed, and Heidi was now 8 years old. One day, Aunt Deet unexpectedly returned to the mountain. Heidi was both surprised and overjoyed to see her because it was the first time Deet had visited in years. Albert, however, wasn't happy to see her. Deet explained that she had come all the way from Frankfurt to take Heidi with her. A wealthy family in the city wanted Heidi to live with them. There, she would have the chance to attend a good school, wear nice clothes, and become friends with a girl her own age. The moment Heidi heard this, her heart sank. She didn't want to leave the mountains. Albert firmly said, "No, Heidi isn't going anywhere. This is her home." But Deet refused to back down. "I've always wanted what's best for Heidi," she argued. "She has no school here, no friends, and no future. In the city, she'll have opportunities she could never have on this mountain." Albert's face darkened with anger. "When you abandoned her here years ago, you didn't seem worried about her future," he shot back. "Now, after all this time, you've suddenly come to take her away? No, Heidi is staying here." The argument quickly grew more heated. Finally, Albert angrily ordered Deet to leave at once. Grumbling to herself, Deet started walking down the mountain as if she had given up. But that wasn't her real plan. She secretly took another trail back up the mountain and found Heidi playing with the goats. Speaking gently, Deet began trying to persuade her. "Heidi," she said with a warm smile, "even your grandfather wants you to move to the city. There you'll go to a great school, make new friends, and have a comfortable life." Deet said gently, "It's what's best for you." Heidi's heart filled with fear. She quietly replied that she didn't want to leave her grandfather. Deet quickly answered, "Your grandpa wants what's best for you too. Even though it breaks his heart, he asked me to take you to the city." Little Heidi slowly began to believe her aunt's word. With a heavy heart, she finally agreed. She thought that maybe her grandfather truly wanted her to have a better life. Deet immediately took Heidi's hand and hurried down the mountain. Tears filled Heidi's eyes as she wondered whether she was doing the right thing. Hidden behind a large rock, Peter watched everything happen. He wanted to stop them, but there was nothing he could do. That evening, after bringing the goats home, Peter ran to Albert's cabin, out of breath. "Aunt Deet took Heidi away," he cried. The words hit Albert like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, it felt as though his heart had shattered. Without another thought, he raced down the winding mountain trails toward the valley. Though he was an old man, he ran as if he were young again. Gasping for breath, he finally reached. Heidi stared in amazement at the towering buildings, the crowded streets, and the endless stream of people. She had never seen such a huge city before. A short while later, they stopped in front of a magnificent mansion. This was the home of Henry, the wealthy man with whom Heidi would now live. After Deet knocked on the front door, a servant welcomed them inside. The moment Heidi stepped through the entrance, she was overwhelmed by the beauty and luxury of the grand house. Suddenly, a sharp voice echoed from the staircase. "Who is this?" The voice belonged to Miss Rottenmeier, the strict middle-aged governess whom Henry had hired to care for his daughter and maintain discipline in the house. She walked downstairs and looked Heidi up and down with obvious disapproval. Heidi's simple dress was dusty, her hair was messy, and she wasn't wearing any shoes. To Miss Rottenmeier, she looked like a wild little mountain girl. Clearly unimpressed, she turned to Deet and asked coldly, "Is this the girl?" Deet quickly folded her hands and replied politely, "Yes, ma'am, this is Heidi. You asked for a girl who had grown up in the mountains. She's kind, intelligent, and gentle. I'm sure she'll be wonderful company for Clara." Miss Rottenmeier frowned and muttered, "We'll see." Deet hurriedly said goodbye to Heidi and left. A few moments later, the soft hum of an electric wheelchair came from the upstairs hallway. Curious, Heidi looked up and saw a sweet blonde girl sitting near the staircase. It was Clara, Henry's 13-year-old daughter, who was unable to walk. Heidi smiled warmly and waved. Miss Rottenmeier spoke firmly. "Clara, this is Heidi. While she's here, she must learn proper manners and follow the rules." "Yes, Fräulein," Clara replied politely. Then she smiled at Heidi and said, "Come with me. Let's go to my room." From the very first day, Heidi and Clara became close friends. Although Heidi accidentally made a few mistakes as she adjusted to life in the mansion, Clara never stopped treating her with kindness. For example, Whenever Heidi got excited, she would sometimes push Clara's wheelchair a little too hard, accidentally sending it rolling into a table. But every time something like that happened, Clara calmly took the blame herself and reassured Miss Rottenmeier that everything was fine. Because of Clara's kindness, Heidi grew to love her like a true friend. Now Heidi had to learn the manners and routines of her new home. The maids bathed her, dressed her in clean clothes, brushed her hair, and taught her how to use a knife and fork at the dinner table. Heidi quietly did her best to learn everything. The biggest challenge, however, was school. Every day, Heidi attended lessons alongside Clara with her private tutor. It didn't take long for everyone to realize that Heidi could barely read. The moment Miss Rottenmeier found out, she was furious. "She knows nothing," she snapped. "An ignorant girl like this has no place in this house." She immediately demanded that Heidi be sent away. But until Henry returned home, they had no choice but to let Heidi stay. No matter how much Miss Rottenmeier wanted to send her away, she couldn't. Clara gently stepped in and said, "We'll teach Heidi little by little. She'll learn." Miss Rottenmeier glared at them, frowned in frustration, and stormed out of the room. Heidi watched the whole scene in silence. She felt embarrassed and ashamed of herself. Slowly, she began trying to adjust to the rules of the mansion. But deep inside, her heart still belonged to the mountain. Almost every night, she dreamed of her grandfather, the green alpine meadows, and the life she had left behind. Sometimes she even sleepwalked through the house. On more than one occasion, they couldn't understand why she preferred the hard floor, and Heidi herself never remembered getting out of bed. Whenever she had a chance during the day, she stood by the window, gazing into the distance, wishing she could see the mountains again. She missed the green pastures, air that had once made her feel so free. One day, Heidi came up with a mischievous idea. She turned to Clara and whispered, "Let's sneak outside today." At first, Clara was nervous because she wasn't allowed to leave the house without permission. But after Heidi convinced her, she finally agreed. They enjoyed the fresh air in the park, admired the lively street, and wandered through the bustling marketplace together. She was furious with anger as punishment. Miss Rottenmeier refused to let Heidi eat dinner that night. She made her stand facing the wall for the entire evening and warned her, "If you ever do something like this again, I'll lock you in the basement." That night, Heidi couldn't bear the humiliation any longer. After everyone had gone to bed, she quietly slipped out of her room. She had already made up her mind. She was going to run away. She stuffed the bread rolls she had saved into the pockets of her coat and carefully crept toward the front door. Slowly, she reached for the handle, hoping not to wake anyone. Just then, a stern voice echoed through the hallway. "Where do you think you're going, Heidi?" Startled, Heidi spun around. Standing behind her was Miss Rottenmeier, holding a lantern. She had been caught. The small bag of bread slipped from Heidi's hands, and the rolls scattered across the floor. Furious, Miss Rottenmeier snapped, "So you were trying to run away? You've been given a warm home, good food, and every comfort imaginable, yet you still don't appreciate any of it." Tears streamed down Heidi's face. From the staircase above, Clara had witnessed everything. Her eyes filled with tears, and she quietly turned and returned to her room, heartbroken. At that moment, Heidi realized that if she left, Clara's heart would be shattered. A few days later, the two friends finally spoke again. Holding Clara's hand, Heidi tearfully said, "I'm sorry. I'll never leave you again. You're my very best friend." Clara hugged her tightly, gazing toward the distant mountain. The very next day, a doctor examined her and explained that Heidi had become heartsick from missing her mountain home. The only cure, he said, was to send her back to the Alps immediately. With a heavy heart, Henry agreed. When Clara learned that Heidi would be leaving, she burst into tears. She begged her father, "Please don't let Heidi go." But there was no other choice. Heidi was heartbroken at the thought of leaving her best friend behind. At the same time, deep inside, she couldn't hide her joy at finally returning home. The day before Heidi's departure, Clara shut herself in her room, too upset to come out. Heidi tried to comfort her, promising, "I'll come back to visit you." But Clara was too heartbroken to listen. On the day Heidi was finally leaving, the servants packed baskets filled with food and thoughtful gifts so she could take something special back to her grandfather in the mountains. Margaret hugged Heidi warmly and blessed her as she said goodbye. Before leaving, Heidi reached into her bag and took out the little wooden bird that Grandpa Albert had carved for her. Handing it to Henry, she said softly, "Please give this to Clara. Tell her I'll miss her very much. And promise you'll bring her to visit me in the mountains someday." With tears in his eyes, Henry nodded. "I promise. When the time is right, I'll bring Clara to see you." As the train pulled away, Heidi waved goodbye from the window. Miss Rottenmeier secretly sighed with relief, believing the mansion would finally be peaceful again. Meanwhile, Clara stood at her bedroom window, tears streaming down her face. Even so, she held on to the hope that one day she and Heidi would meet again. After a long journey, Heidi finally returned to her beloved mountain village. The moment she stepped off the train, she happily kicked off her shoes and ran barefoot through the soft green grass. Her first stop was Peter's house. Peter and his mother were amazed to see her. Heidi hurried inside and warmly embraced Peter's blind grandmother. Then she opened the basket she had brought from the city and gently placed several fresh, soft bread rolls into the old woman's hand. Tears of joy rolled down the grandmother's cheeks. Smiling happily, Heidi raced up the mountain toward her grandfather's cabin. As she ran, she took off the fancy dress she had worn in the city so she could run even faster. In the distance, she spotted the familiar roof of the little cabin. The sun was setting, and Albert stood outside, quietly gazing down the mountain path as if he had been waiting for some. Suddenly, he saw a little girl running toward him. For a moment, he couldn't believe his eyes. The next instant, Heidi threw herself into his arms. "Grandpa, I'm home." Albert's hard exterior melted away completely. His eyes filled with tears as he wrapped his beloved granddaughter in a tight embrace. Months of separation disappeared in that single heartfelt hug. At last, Heidi had returned to the place she truly called home. After coming back to the mountains, Heidi's life was filled with happiness once again. Every day she ran through the alpine meadows, played with the goat, and happily helped her grandfather with his work. She also wrote letters to Clara regularly, filling them with stories about life in the mountains and inviting her to come visit. At last, the long-awaited day finally arrived. After receiving many of Heidi's letters, Clara and grandmother Margaret decided to travel to the Swiss Alps. On a beautiful summer morning, Clara arrived in Heidi's village in a horse-drawn carriage, accompanied by Margaret and several servants. The moment Heidi saw them, she jumped with excitement. She ran straight to Clara and wrapped her in a warm hug. Margaret asked Albert if Clara could stay with them in the mountains for a few days. Albert gladly welcomed them and happily agreed. And so, Clara's unforgettable adventure in the Alps began. Heidi introduced her to the simple joys of mountain life, feeling the first rays of the morning sun, wandering through green meadows with the goat, and falling asleep on a bed of fragrant hay beneath a sky filled with countless stars. Everything was magical and completely new to Clara. For the first time in her life, she experienced a kind of happiness she had never found within the walls of the city. But Peter couldn't help feeling jealous. He believed Heidi was spending all her time with Clara and no longer cared about her. One morning, blinded by jealousy, Peter secretly pushed Clara's empty wheelchair over the edge of the mountain. It tumbled down the rocky slope and was completely destroyed. Albert immediately realized that Peter was responsible. He scolded the boy, who lowered his head in shame. Since Clara no longer had a wheelchair, Albert gently lifted her onto his back and carried her high into the mountain. As she looked out over the breathtaking alpine landscape stretching endlessly before her, Clara's face lit up with pure joy. Just then, a colorful butterfly fluttered through the air and gently landed on Clara's foot. As the butterfly flew away, Clara instinctively reached out to follow. Without even realizing what she was doing, she slowly rose to her feet. For a moment, everyone stood frozen. Then Heidi, Peter, and Grandpa Albert watched in amazement as Clara stood on her own, their eyes filled with tears of joy. Over the next several days, Heidi and Peter carefully supported Clara as she practiced walking step by step. With patience and constant practice, strength gradually returned to her legs. Every day, she walked a little farther and a little more confidently than the day before. Sometime later, Margaret and Henry arrived in the mountains to take Clara home. At first, Henry had been worried that bringing his sick daughter to the Alps had been too risky. But the moment Clara walked to the front door on her own, his worry instantly turned into overwhelming joy. He rushed forward, hugged his daughter tightly, and thanked Heidi from the bottom of his heart for helping make what seemed like a miracle possible. Before leaving, Margaret lovingly handed Heidi a beautiful notebook and a pen. "You love stories, don't you?" she said with a smile. "This is your very own diary. Write in it every day, fill it with your adventures, and always follow your heart." Heidi hugged the gift close to her chest and thanked her with tears of gratitude in her eyes. As it was time to say goodbye, Clara embraced Heidi one last time. "We'll see each other again very soon," she promised. Heidi smiled, waved goodbye, and watched as her dear friends began their journey home. And so, Heidi's touching and heartwarming story comes to an end. In the end, she finds everything she had been searching for: a true family, genuine friendship, and the freedom to live the life she loved. Now Heidi lives happily in the Swiss Alps with her beloved grandfather and her best friend, Peter. Surrounded by the beauty of the mountains, she will always call home. If you enjoyed Heidi's heartwarming journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more inspiring movie stories and unforgettable adventures. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.